Hello, everybody, and welcome to the discussion panel of Terraforming Pollution and Decay When the Environment Fights Back. So I am Sam Barham. I'm the founder of Balancing Monkey Games, which I started as a hobby project and is now 8 to 10 people, depending on how you count. I run it with my wife. We created the game Before We Leave, which is a sort of mostly non-violent strategy game set on a set of hexagonal tiled planets. We released that in 2020, and we're now working on the sequel, Beyond These Stars, where we take the same gameplay to traveling through the galaxy on the back of a giant space whale. And with me, we have Josh, who's going to introduce himself.
Cool. Thanks, Sam. Yeah, I'm Josh, co-founder of Bright Rock Games. Our first game, War for the Overworld, significantly more violent game than Sam's game. Basically, a spiritual successor to the old Dungeon Keeper games. And more recently, we released Galactica, which is sort of a hospital management set in a sort of wacky sci-fi universe. It's a bit nuts. Lisa.
Yeah, so Lise, I'm a game director over at Megapop. We're currently working on the game Life Below that was announced, I don't know, was it a week ago, 2 weeks ago now? Time goes quickly. So really, really exciting for people to finally be able to see it. Been working on it for a while. We are 13 to 15 people, depending on how you count again. And yeah, based in Oslo, Norway.
Cool. Oh, well, thank you for being here. So let's get into it. We have a set of questions as starters for our discussion. So the first question is, in each of your games, how do you land on making the environment a constant active opponent or a real system, evolving as the player goes, and not just a passive backdrop or resource table to farm? What kind of ecological threat or mechanics do you use in your game to challenge the player without being just a way just to punish the player? So who wants to go
Do
first?
you want to go first, Lisa?
Yeah. So I think for me, like when I first started thinking about this question, I was kind of like, well, I feel like, of course, like it's Life Below, for instance, is a city builder at its core, but it has this potential of doing stuff that not many other city builders can do because of how it is like laid up, like because it is underwater, and because we try to kind of keep it somewhat realistic, or like we have talked with marine biologists, talked to scientists about how stuff actually works underwater. And because we've done that, we can kind of go like, okay, so these elements, these occur naturally. How can we kind of gamify that and make it more of a interesting challenge rather than just a static, this is the way the ground works, kind of, or like this is where your resources are, and kind of making it more like a living part of the entire game system. Um, so, for instance, water parameters being quite important for the player. Um, and that is kind of how we try to view it, that, it's underwater and it's based on real life systems. And since they are, then let's try to do that as how can we do that in an organic way so it feels as though stuff is moving, stuff is being affected by different things. I guess that's kind of our approach to it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. I mean, I've had a very too short look at the demo so far, and it's super cool. I haven't gotten too far into it yet, but the very fact there's like a pH level and temperature on each of the areas of water seems very cool. I do want to spend more time diving into that. And like, it's interesting you mentioned the speaking to marine biologists and scientists and everything, and like this is the reality, and then you try and gamify it. That's always a fun problem to have. It's like this is real and it works, but maybe the way it works in real life is not actually particularly fun or interesting. So how do you adapt
Yeah,
that
yeah, for
without
sure.
ruining it? Yeah.
It has been
Mm. We
interesting to see. Oh, sorry.
no,
Yeah.
you go, you go.
Yeah, no, it's just because it's been interesting to see like playthroughs of the demo, and then some people react to like, oh, but that's not how pH works, and it's like, yeah, that's there also isn't a coral that makes algae for as food. Like a natural process, kind of. So it's some things have to be gamified. So it's kind of
Yeah.
finding that thing. Yeah, I don't know if that goes into what you were gonna say, Sam.
No, I was going off on a tangent. So what I was going to say is like we had a similar but completely different challenge with Before We Leave. So I didn't originally set out to make Before We Leave a mostly non-violent game. I have to put mostly on there because there are space whales that come along and eat your people. And we originally described it as non-violent. And someone was like, I was playing this with my son and a space whale came along and ate some of our people. Do you really need to call this a non-violent game? And I was like, yeah, you're right.
Mm,
Um, so but anyway, so we didn't originally set out to make it non-violent, but it just kind of evolved that way. I really did feel like we were just discovering what this game wanted to be as we were making it. And so it became this mostly non-violent game. And then we're like, so how do we challenge the player if there's no violence? And we were taking quite a broad approach to non-violence. So your peeps are vegetarian. We established that all of the lands that you settle were originally yours. You're not taking over lands that used to belong to other people, etc. So we settled on pollution being kind of the obvious thing with a sort of a, given it's got kind of ecological coming back to life after disaster kind of themes. Um, and so, yeah, we just added pollution to the game. It spreads out from your production buildings. It makes your people unhappy. You can clean it up. That costs you resources. And I think one of the main things we did was pollution and all of its consequences is your choice. Like it doesn't happen to you randomly. It's there because you built a building that caused the ground to be polluted. It was your choice to do that. So it's your choice to deal with the consequences. And it's not something you can avoid. The only way to avoid pollution is to sit on your hands, and that's not much fun as a game. um, but yeah, I guess that's part of how we balanced it. We also, things like trees will slowly suck up pollution, so there's a little bit of the environment helping you out, but you need to cut down the trees to build, and so you've got to kind of balance all of those sorts of things going on.
mm,
What about you, Josh?
Yeah. So I mean, again, it's a very different approach because all of our environmental factors are all about the violence for the most part. They're generally about how the player can adapt the environment. I guess in some ways terraform the environment to both defend themselves and attack their opponents. Because I mean, in War for the Overworld, it's a grid-based game. You can dig out the environment and traverse across the environment with your army, but you can also rebuild it and reshape it in order to defend yourself, defend your base. So we wanted to add quite a lot of variety in the types of terrain that we had compared to sort of the predecessor titles, Dungeon Keeper 1 and 2, which were quite straightforward in, I guess, the depth of terrain there. We ended up adding stuff like explosive terrain, which is like we generally put next to things that are valuable. So you might want to go there, get those valuable things. But if an opponent comes along, they might just be able to blow it all up, which is not great for you because then you're wide open and exposed. And similarly, a bunch of different ways that you can kind of dig in and fortify your own dungeon, rebuild the terrain around your dungeon, or freeze it, or reinforce it in all sorts of different ways. Yeah, so a lot more about the violence compared to yours, Sam.
mm.
I mean, we do, as I said, we do have giant space whales coming along and eating strips of your planet, which I mean, I suppose you could also call that an ecological challenge. Um, the
Yeah,
difference being there that there's no way to avoid it. They just turn up. That's life. Um,
yeah, that's
it's
nature,
probably
really.
it's probably subconsciously a metaphor for something, but I couldn't tell you what exactly. And we do give the player tools to deal with that. You can help defend against it in various ways, but those are all like the end game technologies. For most of the game, you're just like, well, that happened, rebuild. Um,
Mm.
yeah.
Yeah, I think the violence aspect it was kind of interesting from especially for the game that we're working on now, like Life Below, in that we kind of take the perspective of nature itself. So since everything there is no humans in the game, so you never have like the human perspective of actually placing down buildings that are human and making the pollution that way. Or it's more like nature dealing with and trying to understand pollution when they face it, and that violence comes in many forms. Like for instance, the water temperature and parameters, they are very damaging, and they do ruin the reef if you don't do anything about it. And every building is actually a living creature, so it is to a certain degree violent because these things are real, like they are living things, but at the same time there are buildings, so you get this strange kind of connection to them that we think is really interesting, but also meant that to kind of like but we had to make some choices with, for instance, like predators, like if you want like sharks to eat your inhabitants, stuff like that, how we're going to deal with that, which has been like an interesting challenge, like how we actually look at violence. And for the most part, we kind of ended up at like the reef tends to sustain itself naturally when you have stuff in balance. So as long as you keep stuff in balance, which is your intended purpose, then things kind of balance each other out um without like being faced a lot with violence. So it's like, is it a violent game? No, definitely not. But is there violence? To a certain degree. Depends a bit how you look at it, I guess.
If there's predators that come and eat your people,
Yeah,
there's violence there.
yeah,
Yeah.
for sure.
I feel like we've got slightly off topic, but
Yeah.
it's all good. I should note, I'm not against violent games. We just happen to make a non-violent game.
No, but I think
Um,
it's really interesting because then
mm,
you've laid that framework. Like you don't have to be against violent games to be making a
mm,
game like that. It's more you laid the framework and made those decisions that made it more interesting down the line. I think like you could use
yep.
those decisions to have more interesting design decisions, right?
It has been a very interesting challenge, I have to say.
Mm,
Trying to strike that balance, because basically mostly fun comes out of conflict and resolving conflict. And how do you have conflict without violence? Has been an interesting design challenge at times.
mm.
But let's move on to another question. So this one's about education. In your games, do you feel you have to somehow teach players about real-world environmental issues, or are you mostly focused purely on emergent strategy mechanics using ecosystems?
This sounds like one
I feel like
for you,
Lisa's going
Lisa.
to have quite an answer to this one.
Oh god. I mean, I remember, especially in the beginning, like when we didn't have a lot of the game like fleshed out or like prototyped up, it was a lot of we often got that question like, is this an edutainment game? Is it mostly just to teach how reefs actually work? And I'm going, no, it's definitely meant to be, a fun game. It's supposed to be like a fun, engaging experience, but it has like the foundation of reality. So we hope that you kind of, I guess, through symbiosis of playing the game can learn something about it, but it's not supposed to be one to one. We try to make it like, like there's like some kind of basis of reality, like I mentioned, that we've talked to marine biologists and scientists and stuff like that, but that doesn't dictate what the game is. It's more, can we find a basis in reality for this? Like, for instance, our what would usually be seen as research points we get from the brain coral and translate it into our world, kind of, and that's kind of like a fun like knowledge being from the brain coral thing. So it's more about like the system is founded in reality and a certain amount of education then, but it's not meant for you to understand everything about a reef at the end of it.
Mm.
It's more to make it feel more alive, maybe, if
Yeah.
that makes sense.
Have you, if players do want to dig deeper and maybe learn more about the actual real science behind it, is there anything in there that players can sort of dig into, like some kind of codex or anything, or have you
Yeah,
considered
yeah.
something like
Yeah, we have a collection book, we call it. So
that?
as you get new species or get new buildings and stuff like that, or structures as we call them, you can read about the actual species it's based on and some fun facts about that sometimes. And, if there's like some information about why we picked that one sometimes. So that's quite neat for those who want to go into that and try to catch them all maybe as well.
Yeah, that's really cool.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But how about
I feel like
y'all?
I was just going to say, I feel like sometimes that kind of, it's not educational, but it's based on something real, can be the most effective way of educating someone in its own way. It's like if someone plays your game and they really like the real basis of what you've built, and then they go away and find things out for themselves, that kind of inspiring people to look further can be really can be quite a powerful way of educating, which is
For
pretty
sure.
cool.
Yeah.
I think
Definitely.
for me, we don't feel any particular need to try to educate players, because I guess our the situation of our game is far enough away from reality, and none of it was like, this is how the real world works, let's put it in the game. It's like, this feels like a fun system, let's put it in the game. Um, but at the same time, I mean, it wound up having quite strong themes of environmentalism and having to look after your environment, and um, all that kind of thing. You emerge from a bomb shelter and everything has recovered, but there's ruined buildings. It's quite clear that something went wrong, and you're emerging into a world that has recovered from that. Um, so it's almost like it became not an educational story about pollution or whatever, but more of a allegory for how things might recover if and when they go wrong.
Mm.
Um, yeah, something like that. How about
Yeah.
you, Josh? I feel like you're not going to have much of an answer, but
No. For this question, I don't have a massive answer. War for the World is definitely not an educational game in any way. Yeah, all of the mechanics around the environment are definitely very arcadey. They're purely focused on the mechanics there. In Galactica, our second title, which although not really very environmental, in regards to this panel, that there is a lot of social commentary in there about modern healthcare and how it's not the best in certain countries that none of us are from, but perhaps elsewhere on the planet. And yeah, we found that kind of important, but we didn't want to shove it in people's faces too much. So it's quite an in some ways understated message in that game. Yeah, but definitely not in War for the Overworld.
Yeah, but I feel like that really goes into what Sam was saying as well. Like it's not necessarily having it like in your face, but having more as like the foundation and the building blocks makes it
Yeah,
even more apparent, or even actually better for the player to understand what
yeah,
you're actually trying to tell them.
yeah.
Um,
You want them to come to their own conclusion with what you've given them instead of telling them what the conclusion is.
yeah, for sure.
exactly.
And it's the same with our like the fact that the water can get too acidic, for instance, is definitely based on real life consequences that are happening in the world. But seen from nature's perspective, so it's not like pointing fingers at anything in particular. But that kind of gives the player like the ability to kind of, okay, that's interesting. Does that actually happen? How does that actually work? And maybe that inspires some like, maybe I can check that out, So that's the hope anyway.
Yeah. All right. I'm going to move on to some specific questions for a bit. Josh, you're up first. In your previous title, War for the Overworld, abandoned dungeon areas can degrade over time. Can you tell us how you designed the dungeon as an active system that requires the player's care and attention for continual upkeep? Is there a real tension between growth seeking, digging and building deeper, and that continuous upkeeping and natural erosion or decay?
Yeah, so that's interesting. Conversely, actually, instead of those things being at odds with each other, they're quite intertwined. I mean, in War for the World, you have your units in your dungeon, and unlike most strategy games, you can't actually control them directly. You can kind of influence them. You might say, "I'd like to attack this," and then if they're happy, they might go and attack it. But if they're not happy, they're just going to go off and do their own thing. Um, and yeah, you do need to continue exploring and digging and acquiring resources, mainly food and gold to keep them fed and well paid, and if you don't do that, if you neglect them, well, then the violence happens. But instead of it being violence that you're inflicting on others, on your opponents, your own units will actually begin to inflict violence on your dungeon and your other units, and then, well, it all starts falling apart at that point. Basically, it's not you're not having a good time. But yeah, like the need to basically continue destroying the environment around you is part of it. I mean, you're evil in this game, right? So like that's kind of the whole thing. You go out and kill people and take their stuff and become a big evil bad guy. So it all fits together quite nicely.
I feel like I had a follow-up question, but it's gone. Oh, we'll move on to Lisa. In a game such as Life Below, what feedback or inputs do you have to help players realize the consequences of their actions, from pollution to habitat building?
Yeah. Well, I feel like it's a bit back to what I was saying before, in that the different elements of the game are living things. So the fact that your structures, they're not just a building that is crumbling apart. It's an actual life that is like turning white and being eaten, in that it's crumbling apart. Um, that let us kind of use that kind of emotional investment, I guess, to like tell the player when something is happening that is either positive or negative. Um, Also, just using the environment. Like there's things that can happen underwater that we try to use, like the growth of seagrass, for instance, is affected by you actually placing things. So the more you place, the more seagrass actually grows. So it kind of like having that philosophy of life brings more life, and the importance of biodiversity and things, and putting that as an active part of the game system. And also then having the negative consequences of your actions, like maybe dealing with this hazard with pollution. Actually, there are various degrees of good ways of dealing with pollution, for instance. And perhaps dealing with it in the easiest way actually doesn't gain you anything. Maybe it actually becomes a bigger problem later. And then using again, things that are based in reality, but without it being like exactly the same. I think. And also then that, since habitat building was mentioned, like that's building and expanding, that actually gives you access to more advanced things, more different species, that you get more exotic species or species that can do things for you as a player. Really like hitting home the need for biodiversity and so on. Yeah, maybe I went a bit away from the question in the end there, but
That's right. That's what panel discussions are for.
yeah.
Yeah. And one for me, it feels weird to read out the question and then immediately answer it, but that's life.
Do you want one of us to read it?
Nah, it's all right.
Sure.
Overdevelopment can harm your settlement in Before We Leave, dropping happiness when nature suffers. How did you design and iterate on that intent to make this mechanic something meaningful and not just punishing, in a context where the player has the pressure to develop? Well, it's interesting. So honestly, the design and iteration of Before We Leave was like, I don't know, this feels good, let's do it. Put numbers in, see how the playtesters react to it. Beyond These Stars, we have someone who is actually a game designer working on it. So they're doing the spreadsheets and the numbers and the analysis. So it's actually going to be a much more balanced game, I have to say, than Before We Leave was. But to describe the basic system, so yeah, you have to expand to build more buildings, to be able to gather more resources, to expand further, to explore further, to discover new technologies and reach new planets. And that's like the whole basis of the game, is trying to get access to all the buildings and build the big buildings and expand out to your whole solar system. But many of your buildings cause pollution. Peeps walking on pollution don't like it. They get unhappy, them getting unhappy makes them move slower, everything takes longer, so you want to try and keep them happy, and there's various mechanisms for keeping them happy. So there's that balance of, you can make them not unhappy by cleaning the pollution up, or you could just go, they're all going to be sad from that, but I'll feed them nice food and give them luxuries instead. But of course, your buildings for producing luxuries will produce more pollution, so it's just round and round in circles, whichever way you go. And yeah, it was one thing. Like the very last update that we released before we finished development was the Wasteland update, and basically we were thinking to ourselves, look, pollution doesn't have quite enough teeth. It's something you can just avoid. Like, you can just live with it. You can just go, that's fine. They're sad from that. We'll just make them happy through other means. So we ended up adding in a mechanic where if an area is too polluted for too long, eventually it will become a wasteland, which was an area which is like, the peeps will not go there. They won't enter it. It's too horrible. All of the buildings within it, even if they're utterly vital to your survival, they just stopped working. Soz. Of course, you have the ability to clean up. You can build an airlock on the edge of the wasteland area, and your peeps will go through it and get into these extremely cute little like hazmat suits, and go and clean up the sort of central node of the wasteland, and it'll go away. But that idea of, if you don't deal with the consequences of your actions, it'll just make your peeps a bit sad. Moving to, if you don't deal with the consequences of your actions, it's actually going to impact your ability to play the game. I think was quite an important step for us to take, and it's something we're thinking much more deeply about in the sequel, and designing in much more thoroughly from the start, which I will talk about properly in a different question, because I saw that's another question waiting for me. But first, I'm going to go back to our other general question. So for all of us, among your games, did you get into a situation where the player's behavior surprised you in a way they managed to subvert intended environmental limitation, boundaries, or effects to optimize their play?
Yeah, so we found, and this only really happened in like multiplayer, was basically because you have to carve out your dungeon, and your units need to be able to walk around to get from place to place to eat and sleep and get paid and do their work and whatever. But that naturally leaves weak points, where an attacking force might be able to get through. But you get to choose where they are and how you fortify them. But we found that sometimes players who wanted to like maximally optimize, they did not allow any doors to exist. So everything was sectioned off, including the core of their dungeon, which is the bit that you have to defend. And they would micromanage everything by picking up and dropping every single unit every single time they needed to go anywhere, which technically worked and did allow their dungeon to be very well defended. But the result was, which it was basically impenetrable and stalemate ended up. So we added a ritual into the game which basically blew up everyone's walls everywhere, including your own, which is quite a fun thing to see. So yeah, that's something we added in one of our last updates, because it was towards sort of the end of the game's life cycle, as people were really trying to optimize and maximize any way they could play the game. But it was good fun to add that in and solve that problem. Yeah.
Yeah, because you saw it as something that you need to kind of solve, or
Yeah, because the game kind of broke. If both players did that, then you couldn't end really.
I suppose. So was it that the attacking forces couldn't break down your walls? Because of course you don't want them reconfiguring your dungeon while they're attacking. So
yeah, pretty much right. Like there are numerous ways that you can kind of reinforce the terrain around your dungeon. But generally there's always weak points, where the entry points are, right? Because your own units need to be able to get in and out and to and from the various places in your dungeon, and that's where you will generally try and attack. But if none of those exist and the player is doing all of the mechanics they can, to fortify their dungeon, there was no stopping it, basically. Yeah.
we had so for a while we ran a few little like competitions, and because so before we leave is single player, so we didn't have all of the players messing with each other that we needed to try and work out how to optimize or avoid or encourage or whatever. But we did have, so we ran a few little competitions. So we added a counter into the game that showed you how many actions you had taken, how many times have you placed buildings or whatever. And so we had a competition. How few actions can you use to get to the point where you're leaving the first island that you start the game on? I think was one of them. And one person figured out that there was something that happened very occasionally, just at random, and it would gain you an extra resource, like an extra wood or something. So to avoid taking one action, he basically left the game running for like 40 hours, just sitting there in order to accumulate enough. I think it was wood, I can't remember the details, in order to avoid taking the one action of like placing a woodcutter building or something. And he won by quite a few. Like he had taken quite a few less actions than I think anyone else, because he was utterly focused. I think he's an accountant or something in real life. Utterly focused on getting just all of the optimization he possibly could out of this game. So that was interesting. We also had a guy coming to me several times being like, look, if I examine your game with like a memory spying program, I can poke these values and change this stuff. And I was like, it's a single player game, buddy. Cool. Have fun. He was like, I'm hacking your game. I was going, yay, fine, go ahead.
Awesome.
Yeah. People are strange. The things that they will try and get up to break your game and think that they're super smart for it. And it's like, yes, you are super smart. That is very, very cool. But I hope you're enjoying yourself.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if I'm looking forward to making a multiplayer game one day or not.
Well, after that, we made a single player game, so.
Mm.
I think our intention is that we would make it co-op if we do multiplayer. Again, sort of, we've decided that the DNA of the studio is going to be within reason to try and make largely non-violent games. So and that sort of lends it to co-op. And then it's like, well, if you're going to hack the game, also do some stupid strategy. As long as you and your buddies are having fun, it's fine. Go ahead.
Yeah, that's the point.
Yeah. Yeah. How about you, Lisa? For the
Yeah.
original question, I guess you haven't released it, so it's harder to answer. But
Yeah, no, I mean, I haven't seen like the super strange behavior yet, but I think as close as I get is that there's this mechanic that you do get pretty common in city builders. You get resources back when you reclaim a building or when you destroy a building, right? But since the heart of the reef has like an energy field around it, so that always is powered. If you get into like a really bad like water parameter situation, like a heat wave, and then and then that kind of starts ruining everything, and then you don't actually have the resources to build what you need to fix it, you can actually just reclaim everything in the zone and just build those things that you need, and then you can stay alive. So if you really want to stay alive, there are ways you can manage to do that rather than starting over. And it's just the dedication of finding that and sticking with it. It's just
mm,
well done.
yeah. So moving on, what's the next thing? I'm going to go in reverse order for these next questions. So for me, in Beyond These Stars, you build up your settlement on the back of a giant cosmic whale. Is there any relationship between the humans and the whale who support it somehow? Does the environment depend on the whale's health or the cohabitation between humans and the giant creature? Wow. um, so the way that Before We Leave ends is you construct this building called the Whale Charmer, and a particularly massive whale turns up, and the implication of the like final image of the game is that your people then go and land on it and build a city on top of its back, which was actually the game I always wanted to make. It's just when I was starting out as a hobby, I was like, that's too big. I can't make that. So we ended up making Before We Leave. And then Beyond These Stars starts out with your spaceship landing on this giant whale. And it's not really a spoiler because it's in the release demo, but it turns out that this whale is intelligent and you can talk to it. And then it's like, okay, now we're going to go and explore the universe with this new friend that we've made. But there is very much a relationship between the two of you. So we established that you are not living on the whale's skin. There's like this layer of debris, this area, this oval area, and that's the bit that you're on. And it's accumulated debris over eons that you can mine into and mine resources out of and grow trees and food on and stuff. And because again, non-violent game, it's like if you can dig into the whale, that's not a good idea. But what you do very much impacts the whale. It is, you are living on a creature. So if you start polluting the ground, it's going to be like, dude, this is my body. What are you doing to me? And the whole ongoing story of the game is one of you and the whale exploring your relationship and your pasts and how that impacts your future. The peeps, are like, we know that we used to have a galaxy-spanning civilization. We want to get that back. And the whale, I don't want to say too much because I don't want to spoil anything, but the whale has a past that you explore through the game. But we're trying to create, without violence, a real tension of like, you are two independent beings, being your civilization and the people and the whale, and you have your own goals, and they aren't always in sync. The whale wants certain things, which is not necessarily what you want. If you want to make your peeps really happy and build a nice big civilization and all the rest of it, then that's not necessarily good for the whale. If you look after the whale and are really nice to it, then that's going to hamper your ability to look after your people. And yeah, so that's kind of, it's almost the core of the game is exploring this tension of looking after your environment, which in this case is embodied in an actual thinking, talking creature, versus looking after your people, which of course is the tension of our modern lives. How do we look after the environment but also look after the people? I remember hearing that during COVID, our global like carbon emissions basically dropped to the level they need to drop to save the planet. And I was like, cool, I don't really want to live like COVID all of the time to save the planet. But at the same time, we have to save the planet. So what are we going to do? Which just got very real for a moment there, sorry. So yeah, that I guess that's kind of where we're at. And I may as well talk about it now, given that it's in the title of the talk. Before We Leave, we didn't have terraforming. You couldn't reshape the land that you had. Apart from anything else, that was partly just a limitation of the way I originally coded the game, that it would have been made all sorts of things difficult. But with Beyond These Stars, we were like, this feel like it's this lumpy tiled game. It just feels like you should be able to terraform it. So we added that in, and being able to create channels and have water flow through it, which enables you to make areas greener, and bring life back to more areas of the whale. And then added that into a mechanic of you only have a certain area of atmosphere and you can only build within that area. So if you want to expand your buildable area, you have to make water flow. You have to add more trees, which will make the whale happier because the whale lives off the greenery on its back. But at the same time, if you're then cutting all the trees down, you've both got consequences of the whale being unhappy with you, and also consequences of the trees are your oxygen source, are your breathable atmosphere, are your range that you can build in. So just trying to have all of these systems that are, feeding into each other, that everything has a consequence for something else, and going round and round and round, trying to keep all the plates spinning. Is how we're adding in that sort of tension to the game where you're not fighting things. All right, Lisa, using the context of the coral reef itself as a system with feedbacks, e.g. heat waves, invasive species, acid spikes that you've talked about already, how do you balance scientific realism with a sense of wonder, hope, and fantasy? Also, how much does a narrative by Rhianna Pratchett contribute to the scientific realism,
Yeah.
or not?
Yeah, it's a big question. And first I just gotta say, like, it sounds super cool what you're doing with your next game, the Beyond the Stars. Like the stuff with the whale and the combination of that. Like for instance, I'm a big fan of Wandering a Village, which if that isn't obvious, and from the game we're making, and that relationship between on the characters. Like, I think like it sounds like a really cool way of approaching that. So it was really exciting the way you described it. So I really look forward to testing it at some point. But yeah, for the actual question. So how we balance the scientific realism and wonder. I think like there's something inherently in us that feel a sense of wonder when you see something like underwater, something living, I guess, like and seeing fish come into your reef and seeing the wildlife and all that coming together. Like there's this inherent sense of wonder. Like people love those documentaries about coral reefs and Great Barrier Reefs and everything when they're happy, and not so much when they're not happy. But so I think that some of that we get a bit for free, like that you just have this feeling of awe. And then of course that the art team is super talented. Helps a lot as well, so it looks gorgeous. But the scientific realism, I don't really see that as like a hindrance to any of the sense of wonder or hope, because it has really just added to it in that like you can feel like you're doing something positive to the world when you're doing these things in Life Below. Like you feel like it's a positive thing that the reef is growing, which is your goal, which is the goal of the characters and the experience. So for me, it hasn't been as much of a balance between those two, but more like a balance of how much should be scientific and how much should be realistic, while still sort of not overwhelming the player. And then the way that we approached that was to add the magical realism aspect, like the magic of it, like the water sprites are based on like angelfish, or like these I've totally forgotten what they're called, but these like microscopic creatures that exist in water, that we have kind of like
Plankton?
scoped up. Yes. I only know their Norwegian names, of course, now that I need to say it in English, although we work in English, so that's great. But since we did that, and then we could scale them up, and so we have that sense of realism, like the scientific realism, in that these things actually do some of the work that they do in the game, but you also get like the human understanding and connection that work is being done. You're building a structure. And of course that the structures don't look one-to-one to the coral species that they're based on. Like they are given this sort of magical oomph to tell you that this is a building that does something, and it's not just an environment piece. And then to the part of the question about Rhianna Pratchett, I don't know if I mentioned it on the stream, but it's such a joy to work with Rhianna Pratchett. She's so talented, and since she's also a diver, it just fit right in. Like she totally got like what we're trying to do with the game. So it wasn't really like a balance there either. I felt like it's definitely contributed to both the realism and the wonder, I guess, to kind of tie together the systems into something that's a bit more human, in like a human understanding of what is happening, rather than just the natural system, if that makes sense.
Yeah, because it's like, it's quite alien in a way, right? A coral reef, an underwater environment, right? Like familiarizing it is definitely super important. I mean, and again, I played a demo very briefly, and you achieved that quite well. I can definitely see that coming through. And yeah, it's interesting hearing about like, the realism basis for a lot of this, and I think one of the things where I guess it's the most unrealistic, I think, is probably the time scale, right? Like, obviously, the coral reef building and forming and coming into existence is like, I mean, I don't actually know this, but I'm presuming hundreds, thousands of years, a long period of time. But obviously, in life below, you're doing it in seconds, minutes. Making that feel right must be quite a challenge.
Yeah, well, hope we've achieved so in a good way. That's the
Yeah.
yeah. It's always a balance. Also, I feel like it's. I'm excited to kind of see if more games kind of start taking this approach as well. Now that we've kind of announced this, and people can try and kind of see how they can kind of twist it to their own, like in their own way as well. I think it's very exciting. But I guess the for the terraforming for you, Josh, I guess it wasn't. Is it based in like the scientific aspect, or is you said it was more very much arcadey? So I guess you didn't much.
Yeah, we have no realism in our game. It's an arcadey grid-based dungeon building game. You dig out cubes, a little bit like Minecraft. No, I can't talk about realism. I would be
I mean, you've got gravity and people
dishonest.
move by walking, presumably, so you've got a
I
little
mean,
bit of
some of them
realism
walk.
there.
Some of them are, like elementals. They just sort of float around.
Yeah, true. Oh, that's life. That's what games are. I love. I can't remember who the quote was, and I can't even remember the quote correctly. But someone said something about programming being basically creating things out of infinite thought stuff. It's like when you're working in software, you can make anything, which is part of the challenge of making games at all. Is like you can make anything. So how do you make any one thing? How do you narrow what you're building down to one thing, one vision, and that can be a real challenge so many times.
It
Um,
very much
Yeah.
is. That's another
yeah,
5 podcasts on its own, though. Like we started
yeah,
talking
yeah.
about
Game,
that.
games are what is it? Games are held together by duct tape in the hopes of the developers.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Yeah,
very much.
the bugs that make the game.
So yeah. So the last prepared question, at least that we have, is for Josh. One could say that in War for the Overworld, more than invading armies, the player's own neglect could be the biggest threat, from starving minions to collapsing defenses. What was your design intention regarding those environmental and time pressures? Um,
Yeah.
and yeah, the original Dungeon Keeper series had a bit of that, but less
Mm.
than in your game.
Yeah, so I mean, I've touched upon this a little bit already, in that we very much wanted to encourage the player to continually need to, go out and exploit the environment, right, in order to keep their own thing going. And yeah, like, sure, the invading armies are always a constant threat, but they're only a substantial threat if you yourself are not maintaining your immediate environment very well. So, as I mentioned before, the fortifying the edges of your dungeon and making sure that your weak points are not too weak are very important. But that in itself becomes quite a complex and intricate loop, because there's a sort of element of constant expansion. You're constantly excavating and growing your dungeon, and the frontier is moving, and ensuring that frontier remains well defended is quite important. And you've got to there's a range of tools that you've got available to you. Your little workers, they can reinforce the walls, and they kind of do that on their own. But you can also replace those walls with more sort of robust terrain. There's structures that you can build around the walls as well that sort of reinforce the terrain around them. Different doors you can put down, and all sorts of things. But conversely, your opponents have sort of a very, very similar range of tools, a bunch of different explosives, and rituals, as I mentioned, rituals where they can blow up all the walls on the map and stuff like that. So yeah, like if you don't maintain your environment, yeah, you're kind of screwed. Not necessarily just because of the environment itself, but because that's what leaves you vulnerable to the violence that I keep coming back to. If it's not your own units that are inflicting violence upon you because you haven't kept them happy, then yeah, your opponents definitely will if your environment hasn't been maintained particularly well, if you haven't defended yourself particularly well, basically. Yeah.
Cool. So do you guys have any other questions that we should discuss? So the topic of this was terraforming pollution and decay when the environment fights back.
So
Open
I
to the
know
floor.
I've spoken about violence a lot, but I also like to see how terrain can also influence your exploration and your ability to explore and expand, and like how different environments you might need different tools in order to both see to begin with and explore into, but then also build into as well. I guess basically like how different types of environments can provide different obstacles for yourself, for the player, that aren't necessarily violent. So I've been interested to see if Ira, have you got any examples of that in your games?
We certainly do. So you've kind of got two forms of exploration within Beyond These Stars in particular. So you are exploring your settleable area, the area on top of Kewa the whale that you're able to explore. And so as I touched on before, there's the challenges of you have to spread water to make trees grow, to spread your breathable atmosphere, to give yourself more space and to reach resources outside of your initial area, some of which are required to unlock later buildings, that kind of loop of like it's not exploration as such because you can see the area, but you are exploring it and that you're gaining access to it. And then being able to terraform to raise and lower the terrain, you can, whether you're flattening areas out because it makes it easier for your peeps to get around, or building towers because you feel like it looks cool. Our artist Tom spent several hours making this massive town, which was all these mesas with bridges and elevators and buildings on top of them and everything, and he had a grand old time doing that. It wasn't efficient, but it looked cool. And just exploring, like almost exploring the system, the systems and how they interrelate. But then, and I don't want to say too much because of course this is outside of the release demo and we're still working on it, but you start exploring a whole galaxy with the whale, and there's dangers in that can affect yourself, what you're building back on the whale, but there's also opportunities. So you start discovering planets that your peeps used to live on, and they can resettle, and you start getting unique resources from them. But of course, you have to leave them behind to keep traveling, and your point of view goes with the whale. And space is cold, and your peeps don't like being cold. And there's areas that you have to travel through that are throwing asteroids at you and damaging your buildings, and various other environmental effects as you're traveling around. And just it takes time to get places, and how are you looking after your peeps while you're wandering through the middle of space where there's nothing warm or friendly going on. So yeah, that's some of what we're doing. How about
Yeah,
you, Lisa?
I just get so excited to try beyond the stars when you talk about it. So awesome. Yeah, I think for the exploration part, I think one of the cool things that we're doing is that you have like the starting zone, and then you unlock new zones or purchase new zones around it to kind of grow your reef. And the fact that those have different biomes that have their own challenges that you then have to deal with, but also that kind of like the pattern, I'm not gonna say too much, but like kind of like the pattern you choose to go out in, or the pattern you choose to explore in, has has an effect on, for instance, how certain hazards behave, or how they show up, or where they show up. And so you could make good or less good choices depending on how you choose to explore, and how you want to like what you feel like you need and want to do. um that both give you like the sense of like exploring, finding new things, new challenges to explore, and new things to do and see, but also having to like kind of go back and still maintain what you already have had, or and upkeeping that. So I think that's like a fun way that we're doing the exploration bit for our part, I think.
Nice.
Cool.
I've been meaning to ask, what is the Norwegian word for plankton?
Well, it's plankton. So it's
Ah.
exactly the
Very,
same.
very exotic.
Near enough.
Yeah, but it's like they're based on like there's very specific zooplankton or something like that. I don't know.
Right.
I'm probably gonna remember it as soon as we close this.
Of course. That's always the way.
Yeah.
Cool. So any other discussion points that you can think of around this topic?
Yeah, I think we've talked a bit about, the some about the terraforming and the pollution aspect. I guess the decay thing is sort of interesting to me because for us, for instance, just to start there, like the whole purpose of the game is to kind of not have decay, like it's to get to an anti-state of decay, and that's kind of like the goal of the player, and that's kind of like a very hard stance to take on that, while it is something that can be like an interesting mechanic wise. So I don't know how y'all deal with decay, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
I think it.
Go ahead, Sam.
Oh, you go
Oh.
first, because you're probably going to have a more interesting answer.
I mean, I actually I was going to say I think I've kind of covered this one already, because a lot of our decay comes through the units basically. Like that's kind of the starting point, as I mentioned. If you do not maintain them, then they sort of start spreading problems throughout your dungeon, and that's where it all starts sort of starts falling apart. But I don't have a huge amount more new to say there, unfortunately. So yes, I will hand over to you, Sam.
Okay. So it's kind of something that we struggled with, and had to do a lot of thinking about all the way through developing both games, is that it's not fun if you reach a point of balance too easily. So if it is possible, and at various times in the development of Before We Leave, it was possible to reach a point where I was like, cool, I'm done. Everyone's happy, everything's just ticking away. And thinking about how, without the outside pressures of I'm going to be invaded by the tribe Bob, whatever. How do you push the player to actually need to keep going and not sit in a state of equilibrium? So of course, we've got the whales coming along and eating bits of your planets, which was like, I think that's one of the reasons why that whole system evolved the way it did, was this realization that you could reach this state of just equilibrium, and we needed something that gave you a reason to have to change things up, or whatever, strive for new things. And also, just having more planets out there, and it's like, you have reached this point of equilibrium, but there's more planets, you could go and find new things. You always gain new stuff by settling on a new planet. yeah, it was a real challenge. So I guess I'm curious, Lisa, if reaching equilibrium is the goal of the game, are there things that you're doing to make sure that that's not like too easy to achieve or too static once you have achieved it?
Yeah, no, that's definitely one of the challenges for us. Like when we started to get the systems put together, kind of like like when you get to equilibrium, what happens then? Um, I think we're leaning on things like the importance of biodiversity, like that certain structures have certain effects that affect the other ones, like or affect the water parameter. So you can't actually just spam 50 of this building like that. Would be very bad for the water. Um, and also the hazards coming in, that they can be quite treacherous and affect the reef in different ways depending on what the hazard is. So for instance, we have this like the biodiversity is actually like a stat, like it's actually a point that you get, like you can get points from having certain new species, and you get more from having new ones, and less from having more of what you already have, and you spend that on kind of growing your reef and researching new things and so on. But you actually can also lose those points if your like the wildlife dies. um, so actually losing wildlife can put you into biodiversity debt, which then hurts the heart of the reef. um, so it's really playing into like the heart of the reef being sort of like the final stand, so to speak, from nature's side. That is both like your last defense and the first thing that is hurt if there's something as dramatic as like colony collapse or like a zone collapse or something like that, from biodiversity deaths. So it's stuff like that that we've been playing with, and also are excited to keep developing on as we get even more people to test the game.
So
Yeah.
your hazards, they basically come along and try and mess with you, right? They're sort of on a
Yeah.
relatively routine basis. Do you have like intelligence behind that? Like if the player is doing better, you might try and knock them off their pedestal a little bit more, because I guess that their point is kind of to what Sam's saying, is there to get in the way of equilibrium in a way, so that there's
Yeah.
continual challenge for the player.
Yeah, for sure. And how much can I say? Yeah. It's a smart system, so it's not set up to like be like, oh, it's day 5, so now a thing has to happen.
Yeah.
It's more like a pool system that is pulled from, and some of them have certain requirements, so that we are sure the player can figure it out what they're supposed to do, although you're not always told exactly what you need to do. The tutorial is quite like the most basic kind of hazard, but when you get further out, there's more complex things. Like I know we've already shown that, for instance, garbage is going to be in, and I think we also mentioned lionfish, which is like a huge thing in the real world as well, where they're an invasive species, that they actually eat a lot, like almost everything that is in the reefs that they infest. Um, so which then again triggers the biodiversity debt thing. So since it's a smart system that pulls from a pool, then you get more like we hope an interesting experience, and like, okay, it's day 5. I must have built these 5 things before that happens. So
Yeah.
that
Yeah, it's interesting. In our more recent title, Galactica, we have basically an incident system, is what we call it, which is very similar to the hazards that you got, and it took quite a long time to get that into a good state of balance. Because the point of that system is again, it's to damage the equilibrium, because that's a game where you build a hospital, you have patients come in and they get treated, and that's fine. And at a baseline, it's relatively easy to get into that state of equilibrium. But the incidents, amongst other things, are basically what we throw at the player to damage that. And we put a lot of work into basically a ton of telemetry in the game, measuring how well you, the player, are doing, and that's how much we decide to mess with you. If you're doing better, we will mess with you more, and if you're not doing so well, if you're already struggling, we will mess with you less, so that you're always just about doing okay, but never perfect.
yeah. I think that's very interesting. Like we've kind of taken the approach that like we want to see kind of what audience really finds life below, like what
Mm.
audience really ends up being the one that is like our core. Like we have an idea, of course, and we have a point of view on that, but when we see like what is our core basis, we can see more of like, should it be more punishing than what we think it should be? Should it be a bit easier? Where should we kind of put ourselves, and maybe difficulty modes when we look at that. But um it's it's an interesting question, like dealing with like how much should you actually mess with the player? Like when is it too hard? When do you just give up because
Yeah.
it is what it is?
We struggle with difficulty a lot as well in Galactica. Like so much so that the first major update it was basically a hard mode, a challenge mode, where because we didn't mess with the player enough, was basically where we ended up. But we had all of the tools and the the telemetry in order to know how to make the game harder. But there were a lot of people that enjoyed that baseline difficulty, but the number one complaint that we did have from quite a significant number of players is that it was too easy. So yeah, we basically ended up going in and adding another mode which used all of those tools we already had available, but basically just mess with the player a bunch more. Yeah, it's really hard when you're doing like a sort of management strategy city builder like game to. I mean, I don't really think it's possible to do a difficulty that works for everyone, right? You have to provide some kind of options, and we didn't have any when we put the game out, and I think that was a big problem for us.
Yeah, we wound up with a whole page of various different difficulty options that you could choose for a new game, because we like it before we leave. It was very much in some ways sort of baby's first city builder. Like it was quite simple and nice. And at its base state, like demolishing a building gives you back all the resources, etc. But then, of course, we had really hardcore people that were like, "I want to be punished."
Yeah.
So it's like, okay, cool. We can wind the difficulty up to 15 and make it just really mean to you in so many different ways. And they were like, "Yes, this is best."
Yeah, I think providing for that is important, but I also think that the baseline experience being approachable is also super important. But you have to
I
do.
agree.
I think you have to do both, or one side of the coin is going to be unhappy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Awesome. Oh, I think we might finish up there. So this has been Terraforming Pollution and Decay when the environment fights back. So thank you to Josh and to Lisa. Thank you to Louise and TactiCon Games for organizing this. And I hope you all really enjoy the other talks and the other events from TactiCon, and we will see you again.
Awesome.
Bye,
Thank you,
everybody.
Sam.
Yeah.